Hollow Knight's origin story goes all the way back to August 2013, when two friends from Australia decided to enter a game jam together. Ari Gibson, a skilled animator, and William Pellen, an all-round designer, first met each other through mutual friends about 10 years before development on Hollow Knight began. William used to be a web designer, but always had a passion for video games, so he started making games in his spare time. He made his first game called Return to Booty Grotto in October 2012 and published it on Newgrounds.com. After that, he made another game the next year called Lulanda, which he developed with Stencil, a tool designed to make games quick and easy. Just like Return to Booty Grotto, Lulanda can still be played on Newgrounds today. William had plans to turn his 2D platformer into a fully fledged game, but he ran into technical issues since his game was getting too big for the software to handle. When William realized he would have to move to a different engine to keep the development going, he decided to let go of the project. While William was getting more familiar with game development, Ari was keeping himself busy with a wide variety of animation projects. He worked for the People's Republic of Animation and was involved with TV, short movies, commercials, and video games. For example, Ari directed a cutscene for the Wii game The Blob. In 2012, he co-founded his own animation studio named Mechanical Apple and produced several award-winning animations. After being friends for many years and sharing a love for video games, especially Zelda 2, William and Ari agreed to join forces and started participating in game jams together. Game jams are an excellent way for developers to flex their skills and test their durability against stress, since you only have a very limited amount of time to complete and submit a game. In August of 2013, the 27th edition of Ludum Dare was held, a game jam community that's been around since 2002. Before Ari and William decided to enter, they invited Rohan Fraser, a talented artist that Ari knew through work, to join their team. These three developers formed the original members of Team Cherry. The theme for the 27th edition of Ludum Dare was 10 seconds, and although Team Cherry was able to successfully create a game within the allotted time, it was arguably not very good. Hungry Night was a simple top-down survival game where you had to slay insect-looking creatures and collect cherries every 10 seconds, otherwise the player character would perish. Unfortunately, the game wasn't very stable and was plagued with frame drops. When the team published Hungry Night on the Newgrounds website, it received a user rating of 1 out of 5 stars. The predecessor to Hollow Knight is still playable today, and nowadays the game has a user rating of 4 out of 5 stars. Even though Team Cherry didn't win the Ludum Dare Game Jam, and gamers didn't seem to connect much to their first creation, Hungry Night did lay the foundation for what was about to become a highly successful indie game. Especially Ari's compelling art style was something the team wanted to further explore. Before they would start development on Hollow Knight, Team Cherry took on 2 more game jams. About a month after Ludum Dare, the 3 developers participated in the Indie Speedrun 2013 Game Jam, and the theme this time around was wealth, while their element was chosen to be mummy. Although they weren't able to finish their game Tomb Cat in time for the Game Jam's deadline, Team Cherry still finished and published it on Newgrounds. The next Ludum Dare Game Jam took place in April 2014, with the theme that year being Beneath the Surface, a theme that would shape and refine the groundwork for Hollow Knight. Around the same time, Ari couldn't stop thinking about Hungry Night and the protagonist they had created. Therefore, the small indie studio decided to combine Hungry Night with the Beneath the Surface theme, and it turned out to be a perfect match. Shortly after Ludum Dare, there was another jam with the theme Beneath the Surface, which we thought was really evocative. We missed the deadline for the jam, but we kept talking about what sort of game we could make that would fit. We thought of the little insect knight exploring a deep old kingdom beneath the surface of the world, and everything kinda snowballed from there. Not long after, Ari and William decided to quit their jobs and go all in with developing their first official video game. For the next couple of months, Ari and William were fully devoted to their new project and worked hard to get a proof of concept off the ground. Ari would take on the role of the game's art supervisor, while William would oversee the game's overall design. The title Hungry Knight was originally chosen because the character needed to eat cherries every 10 seconds, but since that wasn't part of their new idea anymore, they decided to change it to Hollow Knight. When it came to choosing what engine to use, Team Cherry decided to take to Lulanda prototype that William had made with Stencil and adapted it to fit their needs for Hollow Knight. Both Ari and William knew they had to focus on the moment-to-moment mechanics first, and this involved getting the movement of the player character just right. We wanted players to feel totally in control of their character at all times, so our model for movement was the Mega Man and Mega Man X series. The Knight has no acceleration or deceleration on horizontal movement. The jump has a lot of initial lift, releasing the button cuts vertical speed quickly, and the dash completely arrests vertical movement, shooting you forward instantly. Any hit they take or mistake they make could have been avoided right up until the last second. It's a principle we try to roll out through the rest of the game, but it all started with the Knight's run and jump, the very first things to be coded. After the pair was satisfied with the Knight's movements, they directed their attention to the theme that sparked it all, the place beneath the surface. Ari and William had this idea for a mysterious kingdom that had fallen from grace, which ended up becoming Hollow Nest. The game is heavily inspired by the Metroidvania genre, and in those games one of the key elements is the map, so naturally designing the world of Hollow Knight became a major focus for the indie studio. However, they wanted to set it apart from other Metroidvania games, and this became the most difficult design challenge throughout the whole development. The map and the mapping system took a long while to come together. We wanted players to feel like an explorer entering uncharted lands, so we knew that the map couldn't work in a Metroid-style way. It couldn't know the shape of the landscape before the player did, but it also couldn't be so unfriendly that a player would turn off the game in frustration. Their solution was to implement an NPC character that sells parts of the map, while also letting players expand the map themselves as they keep exploring. When the two developers figured out how to approach the map system from a mechanical standpoint, they still needed to make it visually appealing. The map in Hollow Knight almost looks like a maze, but Team Cherry was able to find a good balance between suggesting enough information and not overwhelming the player with details. To further emphasize a sense of discovery and exploration, the team focused on giving the player interesting things to stumble on, such as hidden characters, treasures, and battles. A common criticism of Metroidvania games is the large amount of backtracking that's required. Players often have acquired more abilities at this point, making earlier areas in those games much easier and might cause the overall experience to deflate. Team Cherry was able to partially overcome this problem by making one of the starting areas of the game more dynamic, changing it as the player comes closer towards the ending. A lot of the art in the game was hand-drawn by Ari and scanned directly into the engine. I photographed them with my phone and cleaned them up on the computer. From there, it's just adding pieces into the world until it feels full. Keep it simple was our visual goal. That mantra carried through to the rest of the art, and was probably integral in us being able to create so large a world in 2 years. Ari and William had big ideas for Hollow Knight, and without funding, or any form of income for that matter, they wouldn't be able to execute their full vision for the game. Therefore, when no less than 5 sections of the map were completed after about 6 months of development, the team felt it was time to try and take it to the next step, and launch a Kickstarter. On November 18th, 2014, the Hollow Knight Kickstarter went live, and the funding goal was set to 35,000 Australian dollars. While the Kickstarter ultimately shot past that goal with over 57,000 Australian dollars from more than 2,000 backers, Team Cherry only reached their funding goal 3 days before the Kickstarter was over. Near the end of the Kickstarter, however, donations skyrocketed, so some of the more interesting stretch goals were funded, including a Wii U port and an additional playable character. Shortly after the launch of the Kickstarter, Rohan Fraser decided to depart from Team Cherry to focus more on his career as an animator and illustrator. Ari and William had now secured the future of Hollow Knight's development and were able to hire more people to help finish the 2D platformer. David Causey was brought on board as a technical director to assist with coding the game, while Chris Larkin was hired to produce the game's music and sound effects. Chris had already worked with Ori once before, on one of Ori's short films called Motorbike. After the successful Kickstarter, the team was also able to afford office space and moved their studio to the city of Adelaide in South Australia. Besides funding the development, the Kickstarter was also a clear sign for Team Cherry that Hollow Knight resonated with gamers. It was the first signal, conceptually at least, that we were onto something cool. We ran a beta several months after that, which included the entire first area of the game, the Forgotten Crossroads. It was a stellar response to that area that really cemented our direction for Hollow Knight. Since the studio would now be porting the game to the Wii U, they needed an engine that was a bit more flexible. With the help of experienced programmer David Kazi, they were able to drop Stencil and upgrade to the Unity engine. Aside from better flexibility, the engine also allowed them to add more visual flair, which became apparent when the developers put the results side by side. Hollow Knight was originally scheduled to release in June 2015, and back then the team estimated that the game would only be around 2 to 3 hours long. Thanks to the success of the Kickstarter, however, the team was able to drastically expand the scope and add more content. For example, the developers added a lot more areas to explore in the Kingdom of Hallownest. More areas also meant more different kinds of enemies and bosses, which took a huge chunk of time to develop. Ari was mainly responsible for all the art in the game, and he has said that many of the character designs were done on the fly and started with a single sketch. Because of time constraints, he wasn't able to iterate on most of his designs, so whatever he drew in his sketchbook would go straight into the game. Sketches like these, while seriously crude, form the basis for most of the game. To date, I filled 3 sketchbooks for Hollow Knight. Almost everything within makes its way into the final game. Very little is wasted. Most of these sketches are produced on Thursday nights, at a cafe meetup of local artists. The sketches produced during that event tend to cover about a week's worth of final work. Once Ari had drawn a sketch, he would place it into Photoshop to make a digital version, and animate it in Photoshop as well. This whole process could take up to a week for a boss character, but for a normal enemy, Ari was able to do it much faster, sometimes in less than 2 hours, including programming the enemy in Unity. To streamline this process, Team Cherry used a plugin for Unity called Playmaker. This plugin provides a visual programming system through the use of flowcharts, making it much easier to understand how to implement things like the enemy AI. William, with a basic knowledge of coding, was now able to program a lot of the enemy behavior himself, giving David more time to focus on other programming tasks. In the end, a total of 149 enemy characters were created for the base version of the game, with over 30 of them being bosses. It is worth noting that a lot of the art was conceived in collaboration with William, who was normally very busy constructing the game's systems, but occasionally he would come up with his own character designs. The cartographer is one of those designs. Ari added that Hollow Knight's overall look and feel is really a middle ground between him and William, including elements like lore and dialogue. Speaking of dialogue, both Ari and William are responsible for all the text in the game. They always had a basic plot planned out for Hollow Knight, but much of the lore was added organically as the team added more content. The final version of the script ended up being around 20,000 words long and was all written in a Google spreadsheet. Hollow Knight was influenced by many different titles, such as Metroid, Castlevania, Zelda 2, Vaxanadu, and the aforementioned Mega Man X. Furthermore, the badge system that's present in the game was directly inspired by Paper Mario. One of the more interesting and unique mechanics originated from an interview where Team Cherry was asked what happens to the player when they die. We said something like, "Oh, it'll be a great surprise," and then after the interview we realized we hadn't actually considered that yet. We had already completed the knight's death animation, which ends with his head falling to the ground and cracking. We thought it might be interesting if you had to travel back to the place you died, find the skull, and crack it open to regain your money. Then we kicked around some ideas about the skull being possessed by an enemy, or suddenly fighting back, which seemed really funny. This evolved into the idea of leaving behind a ghost of your previous life that attacks you, which eventually became the shade that you encounter in the final game. This is a really good example of a simple mechanical idea we made early on that seemed inconsequential at the time, ending up having a huge impact on the lore and the history and the nature of the character you play as, which happened a lot. As mentioned before, the game's music was performed by Chris Larkin, who was given a lot of freedom and support by Team Cherry. The main instruments Chris used were the piano and the viola, and he worked on the soundtrack on and off for about 2 years, giving him plenty of time to refine the musical themes in Hollow Knight. Since the narrative becomes more clear as you progress in the world of Hallownest, Chris wanted to reflect this in the soundtrack, which is why he decided to implement leitmotifs. Leitmotifs are more commonly used in film and opera, and Chris describes it as a short melodic phrase that gets used in certain places or themes. In Hollow Knight, this translates to certain melodies coming back later in the game to connect specific areas and themes. Although there's no real spoken dialogue in the game, there are a lot of voices attached to characters, and most of those were done by William, Ari, and someone Team Cherry shared an office with. That someone is Makoto Koji, who runs her own animation studio called Paper Rabbits, and she provided about 90% of the female voices. Some of the rest of the voiceover work was performed by friends and families of the developers. As the team came closer to the end of Hollow Knight's development, they hired Matthew Griffin to market the game. Matthew reached out to streamers and content creators to play and cover Hollow Knight, in order to create as much word of mouth as possible. He also set up a deal with Fangamer to help release Hollow Knight related merchandise. Additionally, he also scheduled many interviews with news outlets. While Team Cherry had already created quite a lot of word of mouth through Kickstarter and the many blog updates about Hollow Knight's development on Team Cherry's website, it was still crucial to create as much buzz as possible right before the game's release. The small indie studio's reputation, and possibly their future, all relied on whether or not Hollow Knight would go on to become a success. While their original Kickstarter goal was set to $35,000 Australian dollars, their estimated final budget for the game was between $90,000 and $100,000 Australian dollars, which was well over the amount of money they ultimately received from Kickstarter and PayPal donations. Because of this, the developers were forced to take out a loan to cover some of the development costs. During the course of development, Team Cherry had to make some drastic changes, sometimes even cutting huge chunks of content that were already implemented in the game. A good example of this is an area that was called the Bone Forest. It was a huge later game area filled with lava. Cutting it was tough at the time. It seemed so cool, but it was totally the right thing to do. William and I were already slammed with all the other enormous areas to build, and they all would have suffered for Bone Forest inclusion. A major part of development was spent balancing the difficulty, especially towards the end, when more testers were brought in to play the game. To get more accurate feedback, they used free applications like Trello to provide a way to highlight bugs and other problems. Some testers described the game's difficulty as pitch perfect, while others said it was punishingly difficult. From the beginning of development, Team Cherry leaned more on making the game easier through various ways, such as guiding players clearly, offering help through characters in the world, and the general flow of the game. Another smaller example is the slash size of the knight. The slash has been growing through all of development, and it just keeps going. It's grown to the point where you can sometimes whack enemies through walls and ceilings, and that's great. We're huge fans of small game breaks that allow players to cheat their way towards victory. The promised Wii U version was eventually dropped in favor for a Nintendo Switch version. By early 2017, it was clear that the Wii U was at the end of its life cycle, so it made much more sense to port the game to Nintendo's newest console. Yet it was still a difficult decision that Team Cherry had to make, since they promised Kickstarter backers a Wii U port. Luckily, by the time the Switch version was released, many backers had already moved over to the newer hybrid console. After almost 3 years of development, Hollow Knight was released on PC on the 24th of February 2017, followed by the Mac and Linux versions later that year on the 11th of April. The game received universal praise from critics and gamers, with many reviewers calling Hollow Knight a masterpiece. Everything from the combat to the lore seemed to click with gamers around the world, and it didn't take long for the game to sell 500,000 copies. After its release, there was still a lot of work left to be done. For starters, Team Cherry was still hard at work to finish the Nintendo Switch port. Fortunately, they were able to hire another Australian studio called Jumpshark Studios, who helped to rework the game's code for the Switch. The original plan was to release Hollow Knight on the Switch shortly after its release, but the team had to delay the game to June 12, 2018. That day, Nintendo's E3 Direct presentation took place, and during the presentation it was announced that Hollow Knight would be available to purchase later that day. The Switch version was surprisingly popular, with 250,000 copies selling 2 weeks after its release. Besides the Switch port, the studio was also figuring out how to implement a second playable character that was funded during the Kickstarter. During this story, you meet a character called Hornet, and Team Cherry intended to make her a playable character in an upcoming DLC pack for Hollow Knight. However, in February 2019, it was announced that Hollow Knight would get a fully fledged sequel called Silksong, and that Hornet would be the main character. Between the game's release and the announcement of a sequel, Team Cherry worked on many updates to optimize the game, and even released 4 free DLC packs. Hidden Dreams, The Grim Troop, Live Blood, and the final DLC pack Godmaster all provided fresh new content, such as new boss encounters, new quests, new music tracks, new enemies, new charms, and so on. This kept the experience fresh for veteran players and gave new players all the more reason to pick up and play Hollow Knight. In 2018, the game was eventually ported to Xbox and PlayStation as well, with official physical editions of the game coming out in 2019. In February 2019, Team Cherry revealed that Hollow Knight had sold over 2.8 million copies. Thanks to this overwhelming success, and with Silksong on the horizon, Team Cherry is able to keep living their dream and make video games for a living. Our goal was always to get ourselves into a position where we could just keep making stuff, and we're grateful we've gotten there thanks to everyone's support. Defining success back then was easy. It was just selling enough to be able to make another game. Had we achieved only that, we would have been happy.